The rain had been falling in sheets for hours. The sidewalks of downtown Palo Alto glistened under the dim light of flickering street lamps, and the few pedestrians that remained were hunched under umbrellas or rushing to get indoors. Among them was a thin, soaked figure with a battered backpack slung over one shoulder. Daniel Price, 22 years old, broke, alone, and about to make the most unpredictable pivot of his life. Daniel wasn't supposed to be in Silicon Valley. He had come to California on a Greyhound from Ohio 2 weeks earlier with barely $200 to his name, convinced that he could talk his way into a job, any job, in tech. He had no degree, no real coding experience beyond a few self-taught Python scripts, and nothing but a passion for technology and a head full of idealistic ambition. What he did have was an old Dell laptop with cracked hinges, a couple of worn-out outfits, and a voice in his head that kept whispering, "Just don't go back home." The night before, Daniel had slept behind a dumpster behind a Vietnamese restaurant. He hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days. He had spent the afternoon trying to sneak into Stanford's library for free Wi-Fi and had been kicked out twice. The last of his money had gone to coffee and a phone charger. He had emailed over 200 tech companies, begging for unpaid internships, volunteering to sweep floors, write documentation, clean bathrooms, anything to get a foot in the door. No one replied. So when he saw a tall man in a hoodie getting into a black Tesla outside a cafe on University Avenue that night, he didn't think. He acted. "Hey, excuse me, sir." Daniel jogged up, slipping slightly on the wet concrete. "I'm sorry to bother you. I need a chance." The man turned, slowly, with an expression that was both cautious and curious. His face was partially obscured by the hoodie, but Daniel recognized him instantly. Mark Zuckerberg. The co-founder of Facebook stood in front of him with the kind of presence that commanded silence. For a full 5 seconds, he didn't say a word. Then he asked, "What did you say?" Daniel's mouth was dry, but he forced himself to speak. "I need a chance. I'm not asking for money. I'm not asking for a job. Just give me a task. Anything. If I fail, you'll never hear from me again. But I swear, if you give me one shot, I won't waste it." Zuckerberg narrowed his eyes, almost amused. "What's your name?" "Daniel. Daniel Price." The Tesla door clicked shut as Zuckerberg stepped away from it, looked Daniel up and down, and said something that would change the young man's life forever. "Get in." The inside of the car smelled like clean leather and technology. Daniel was too shocked to speak. He kept expecting someone to yell at him, to call security, to drag him out. But instead, Mark drove in silence for a few minutes before saying, "You know how to code?" "Some. I mean, not like Facebook engineers, but I taught myself a bit. Python, some JavaScript, Flask, a little Rust, not great. But I'm learning fast." "Why are you here?" Daniel exhaled. "Because everything back home felt like a dead end. My dad left when I was 10. My mom works 2 jobs and still can't pay rent. I didn't finish college. I just kept thinking that if I could get to Silicon Valley, maybe I'd find someone crazy enough to let me try." Zuckerberg nodded. Then he drove them to an unmarked building near the Meta campus. Inside was a private co-working space, empty except for a few glass desks, a massive whiteboard, and a wall of servers humming quietly in the back. Mark handed Daniel an iPad with a problem set on it. "If you can build a functional prototype of this idea by 6 a.m., I'll consider letting you stay another day." Daniel didn't even read the full instructions before nodding. He worked through the night. He didn't sleep. He coded through hunger, exhaustion, and the shaking cold of wet clothes. It wasn't pretty. The app barely functioned, and the UI was a mess. But by 5:50 a.m., he had a working minimum viable product, a data visualization tool that mapped real-time sentiment analysis from social media and displayed it by region. The back end was duct-taped together with Python, and the interface looked like it belonged in 2008, but it worked. Zuckerberg returned at 6:02 a.m. He reviewed the prototype silently. "Not bad," he finally said. "Terrible design, but not bad." Daniel grinned through bloodshot eyes. "I can fix that." "You have 48 hours, Zuckerberg said, tossing him a keycard and a Meta hoodie. There's a shower down the hall. Get some sleep. Daniel didn't leave the building for the next 5 days. He worked in silence, often sleeping under the desk. Engineers from Meta started stopping by, curious about the random kid camped out in Zuckerberg's private test space. One by one, they offered tips, helped him debug, shared Red Bulls and ramen. Word spread. By the end of the week, Zuckerberg introduced him to the internal Moonshot team, developers working on experimental tech that might never see the light of day but had the potential to reshape entire industries. He didn't promise Daniel a salary, just a spot. Over the next 6 months, Daniel earned one. He became known as the kid on the team, not because of his age, but because of the almost mythical way he had entered the company. He wasn't on the payroll for the first 2 months. He worked for food vouchers and the occasional guest badge. But he kept showing up. He kept building. He stayed late when others went home. He asked questions that no one else asked. He found solutions by stitching together tools from 5 different programming languages. He didn't code like a meta engineer. He coded like someone who had nothing to lose. And that made all the difference. 6 months after that rainy night, Zuckerberg invited him to a private strategy retreat in Big Sur. Daniel thought he was there to take notes. Instead, Zuckerberg handed him a badge. Official employee. $150,000 starting salary. Stock options. Housing. Health insurance. Everything. Daniel cried. Not because of the money, but because someone had finally said yes. What followed was a whirlwind of progress. He helped design the back-end infrastructure for a decentralized content filtering system. He co-authored a patent on an experimental compression algorithm for metaverse avatars. And when Meta acquired a tiny AI startup for $12 million, it was Daniel who led the integration team. Journalists eventually caught wind of the story. The homeless hacker who crashed Meta became a viral headline. But the truth was quieter, more honest. Daniel hadn't hacked his way in. He had begged, worked, suffered, and outlasted. He never got cocky. He never forgot the dumpster behind the Vietnamese restaurant. Even with his new apartment overlooking the bay, he kept his old laptop on a shelf, hinges still cracked, as a reminder. And every time a new intern or junior developer looked nervous walking into the building, Daniel was the first to say, "Hey, I was in your shoes once. Let me show you around." To this day, he insists it wasn't luck. It was timing, he says. Right person, right moment. But you've got to be ready when that moment comes. And that moment, for Daniel Price, came in the form of a hoodie-clad billionaire, a rainy Palo Alto night, and a single question. What's your name? Daniel's rise at Meta wasn't meteoric. It was relentless. He didn't chase the spotlight. He chased problems. He asked to be put on the messiest, least desirable internal projects, the ones that had stalled for months or been quietly shelved. His thinking was simple. If no one else wanted to touch it, he had less to lose. One of those projects was an internal tool meant to detect synthetic activity across Meta's platforms, fake users, coordinated bot networks, misinformation campaigns. It had been languishing in development for over a year, passed between teams like a hot potato. Engineers whispered about it in frustration. The codebase was a nightmare of legacy systems duct taped to half-finished machine learning models. Daniel asked for it specifically. He locked himself in a corner of the Moonshot lab with nothing but whiteboards, headphones, and cold brew. For 2 weeks, he barely spoke to anyone. By the time he emerged, he had rebuilt the detection algorithm from scratch using a hybrid model of network heuristics and anomaly detection. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. And it caught something no one expected, a coordinated effort from a foreign agency using real human accounts instead of bots, manipulating comment sections to sow division. The discovery made its way up the chain within hours. Government liaisons were called. Internal security teams spun into motion. Zuckerberg himself called Daniel into a private meeting. "You just flagged something the NSA didn't catch," he said, visibly impressed. Daniel didn't know whether to be proud or terrified. From that point on, his role changed. He wasn't just the scrappy kid anymore. He was part of Meta's internal think tank, a cross-functional group of engineers, designers, and strategists with the freedom to explore, experiment, and sometimes fail. He was assigned a formal mentor, a veteran engineer named Riya Kapoor, who had once led infrastructure for WhatsApp and knew more about distributed systems than most professors. But even as Daniel grew into the role, imposter syndrome never quite left him. He still felt like the outsider, the lucky one, the anomaly. So he compensated by working harder than anyone around him. He kept a notebook filled with technical questions he didn't understand, then stayed up every night learning the answers. He kept showing up early, leaving late, reviewing code twice before submitting it. Meanwhile, word of his background quietly spread. Meta HR had no idea how to categorize him. His employment paperwork had been backdated and irregular. His original application didn't exist. He had no degree, no resume, no references. The recruiters hated it. The engineers loved it. It wasn't long before other companies came knocking. Recruiters from Apple, Google, even SpaceX reached out with thinly veiled offers. But Daniel wasn't interested in jumping ship. "You don't abandon the person who gave you your first lifeline," he told a friend. Still, Zuckerberg noticed. One afternoon, Mark called Daniel into his soundproof conference room with only one line of text written on the whiteboard. "Meta seed. What's this?" Daniel asked. Mark smiled faintly. "Your next step." Over the following months, Zuckerberg pitched him the idea in fragments, an internal accelerator program for ideas that didn't fit cleanly into Meta's existing business models. It would be a sandbox where talented individuals could launch mini startups inside the company. No red tape, no bureaucracy. If it failed, it failed. If it worked, Meta would back it all the way. Daniel's eyes lit up. "And you want me to, what, join the team?" "No," Mark said. "I want you to lead it." The imposter syndrome came crashing back. Daniel barely spoke during the first 5 minutes of the meeting. "I'm not qualified," he mumbled. "I've never managed anyone. I've never even run a team." Mark cut him off. "Neither had I when I started Facebook." And so MetaSeed was born, quietly, under Daniel's direction. He was given a team of 6 engineers, a dedicated budget, and the freedom to build whatever they wanted, as long as it had the potential to change how humans interacted with technology. The first few months were rocky. Leadership didn't come naturally to Daniel. He stumbled through meetings, over-explained in presentations, micromanaged out of nervousness. But slowly, he learned to trust the people around him, to delegate, to listen more than talk. Their first real project was called EchoFrame, a real-time voice cloning system meant to improve accessibility for people who had lost their ability to speak due to illness. Using just 10 seconds of sample audio, EchoFrame could generate a synthetic voice that sounded almost indistinguishable from the original. It was technically breathtaking, ethically complex, and emotionally raw. They tested it with a man who had lost his voice to ALS. When he heard his own voice, his real voice, reading a letter to his wife, he wept openly in the testing room. Meta's internal ethics board raised concerns. Could this tech be misused? Deepfakes? Fraud? Misinformation? Daniel fought hard to keep the project alive. He argued for transparency, consent-based models, watermarking protocols. Eventually, they won approval to pilot EchoFrame in hospitals under strict conditions. Within 6 months, it had been rolled out to over 20 clinics across the U.S. Daniel had led that. He had seen it from whiteboard to deployment. He started getting invited to speak at conferences, not as a symbol of rags to riches, but as a serious technical leader. He turned down a TED Talk twice. He preferred the lab to the stage. One night, back in his apartment, he looked out at the bay and realized he hadn't thought about the alleyway behind the Vietnamese restaurant in months. He still carried the old backpack, though. Still kept the cracked laptop. And then came the email that changed everything again. Subject: confidential opportunity. From mz@meta.com. Body: you ready to step outside the walls? It was an invitation to a skunkworks team, something even more secret than MetaSeed. Zuckerberg had quietly been assembling a small group to explore post-screen interfaces, tech that would replace the phone, the laptop, the headset. They called it null space. There was no org chart, no deadlines, No rules. Just one goal: figure out what comes after the internet as we know it. Daniel accepted without hesitation. What followed was the most intense year of his life. He worked alongside neuroscientists, physicists, philosophers, and artists. They explored ideas like brain-computer interfaces, scent-driven memory triggers, tactile information encoding. Daniel led the systems team tasked with building a real-time feedback layer that could translate physical gestures into navigable commands without a screen. Think, using your hands to surf the internet midair, Minority Report style, but no gloves, no cameras. Their prototype, Thread, was nothing short of revolutionary. It used ultrasonic mapping combined with personalized gesture profiles to let users navigate information through subtle movements. No screens. No cables, just presence. When Zuckerberg demoed it for Meta's board of directors, the room fell silent. Not because of the tech, but because it felt inevitable. Daniel Price, the broke kid who once slept behind a dumpster, was now one of the architects of Meta's post-screen future. And still, he remained humble. In interviews, he always credited his team. In speeches, he talked about his failures more than his wins. And when asked what he wanted to do next, he always gave the same answer. I want to find the next kid like me. The one who's hungry, scared, but not broken. The one who just needs someone to believe in them. Because he knew what it felt like to be invisible. And he had sworn, from the moment Mark Zuckerberg handed him that keycard, that he would never let someone like him be ignored again. By the time Thread went into closed prototype testing, Daniel was already being called the street prodigy in private circles across Silicon Valley. Not by his request, he hated the nickname. But the story had taken on a life of its own. Investors whispered about him at dinner parties. Young coders followed his GitHub commits like scripture. And more than once, rival companies quietly tried to poach him with blank check offers. He turned them all down. His loyalty to Zuckerberg was absolute, not because he worshipped him, but because he respected the risk Mark had taken. Anyone can bet on a resume, Daniel once said. Mark bet on a stranger. But even loyalty has its limits, and in late 2023, Daniel reached a crossroads. It started quietly. A member of his nullspace team, Maya Bennett, approached him late one night with an idea that had been bothering her for weeks. What if we're solving the wrong problem? She asked. What if the future of tech isn't about making humans more efficient, but making them more aware? Daniel, intrigued, invited her to explain. Maya sketched out the concept of StillNet, a system not designed to deliver information, but to withhold it. A kind of anti-feed that helped users focus, reset, and disconnect. Instead of more screens, more alerts, more stimulation, it gave silence. Stillness. The absence of input as a service. The idea sounded absurd on paper, but something in it sparked Daniel's imagination. After years of chasing innovation, chasing velocity, chasing complexity, the thought of building something that slowed people down felt almost radical, maybe even necessary. He brought the idea to Zuckerberg. The meeting lasted only 15 minutes. I love the concept, Mark said, but it's not what Meta does. Our infrastructure is built for scale. Attention. Growth. You want to do this, you'll have to go off-platform. Daniel nodded. He knew what that meant. And just like that, after nearly 3 years at Meta, Daniel Price walked away. He didn't leave in scandal or in anger. There was no press release, no dramatic LinkedIn post. Just a quiet farewell message to his team, a lunch with Mark at a tiny Thai restaurant, and a plane ticket to Seattle. StillNet would be his first independent venture, and it would be everything Silicon Valley wasn't. He and Maya started in a one-bedroom apartment with borrowed furniture and an old whiteboard he'd kept from his Meta seed days. They didn't build an app, not at first. They built principles. No ads, no data collection, no growth hacks. StillNet would work in microbursts, 10-minute, off-grid, windows that gently severed your digital connection, forcing your mind to reset. The idea was to build technology that got out of your way. Funding was nearly impossible to raise. VCs didn't understand it. You're building a tool to not use tools? One investor asked, confused. But a few angels saw the vision. mostly ex-founders burned out by their own success. They raised $800,000, barely enough to cover 12 months of burn. Daniel and Maya moved into the office to save on rent. They coded nonstop. They tested the app on friends, therapists, meditation coaches. They tweaked everything. The screen gently faded to black instead of locking. The phone buzzed to tell you to not pick it up. One feature even forced the user to go outside and take 100 steps before the device reactivated. It was weird, but it worked. When they launched the beta quietly on Product Hunt, they expected a few hundred downloads. They got over 60,000 in 48 hours. The site crashed. Daniel barely slept for 3 days. A single tweet from a tech wellness influencer sent their servers into overdrive. And then came the emails. From teenagers battling addiction to doom scrolling. From soldiers using it to manage PTSD. From parents trying to reclaim family dinners. Stillnet was doing something no one expected, healing people. Within 6 months, they had over 500,000 users. Stillnet wasn't flashy. It didn't trend on TikTok, but it quietly embedded itself in the lives of people who needed it most. The New York Times called it the anti-app the world didn't know it needed. But with growth came new pressures. Competitors emerged, copycat apps backed by bigger firms, infused with funding and features and marketing muscle. Some even tried to reverse engineer Stillnet's code. Offers to buy the company flooded in, including a serious acquisition proposal from Apple. $30 million. Daniel said no. He didn't want Stillnet to become another product line. He wanted it to remain what it was, a tool for reclaiming attention, not monetizing it. But the toll was real. He worked 80-hour weeks. Maya took a leave after a minor breakdown. Their team was small, overstretched. Daniel tried to do it all: development, customer support, partnerships, investor relations. He began to burn out. It was Zuckerberg who noticed. They hadn't spoken in months. But Mark emailed him out of the blue, inviting him to a private dinner in Menlo Park. Just the two of them. No press. No agenda. They talked for 3 hours. Mark didn't offer to buy Stillnet. He didn't offer advice. He just listened. And then, toward the end, he said something that stuck with Daniel. "You've always thought I saved you," Mark said. "But I didn't. You just needed someone to open the door. You walked through it." Daniel flew back to Seattle the next morning and called a company-wide meeting. He told the team they were pausing all expansion plans, freezing hiring, and refocusing on core stability. Then he did something most founders never do. He took a sabbatical. He spent a month traveling the country by train, visiting libraries, talking to students, journaling by rivers. He visited his mother in Ohio and surprised her with a fully paid mortgage. He even stopped by the old Vietnamese restaurant, which had since closed. He stood behind the alleyway dumpster and cried. When he returned, something in him had changed. He no longer felt like an imposter. Stillnet would eventually stabilize at 2.4 million active users. Enough to be sustainable. Enough to matter. Daniel never took it public. He never cashed out. He paid his team well, reinvested in mental health R&D, and quietly funded scholarships for underserved students learning computer science. He turned down Forbes. He avoided panels. He deleted social media. To him, success was never about prestige. It was about peace. Years later, when a tech documentary crew finally convinced him to sit for an interview, they asked him what advice he had for people chasing the Silicon Valley dream. Daniel laughed softly. "The dream isn't in the millions," he said. "It's in the moment someone sees your code and says, 'Hey, this helped me.' That's the whole thing. Everything else is noise." And when they asked him what he thought would have happened if he hadn't stopped Zuckerberg that rainy night in Palo Alto, he paused. "I'd probably still be out there," he said. "Trying. Knocking on doors. Writing code in diners. I don't know. But I'm glad I asked." That's what changed everything. Not the luck. Not the timing. Just the asking. Then he stood, shook hands, and walked off set. No entourage. No limo. Just Daniel Price, the once broke student who asked for a chance, and earned everything that came after. In the years that followed, Daniel Price became something of a myth. Not the kind splashed across billboards or paraded through glossy magazine spreads, but the kind told in whispered conversations among hackers, startup founders, and college dropouts. His name carried weight, not because of wealth, but because of origin, because of how he had gotten there. He stayed out of the public spotlight. He never published a memoir. When a major Hollywood studio pitched a biopic, he politely declined. "I'm not a product," he told the producer. "Let people tell the story however they want. It's theirs now." But the story kept evolving. Stillnet remained independent, quietly expanding through partnerships with universities, mindfulness clinics, and even rehabilitation centers. Daniel refused to grow it faster than it could sustain itself. No VC rounds, no IPO, no exit. Instead, he launched something else. It started as a late-night idea scrawled on a napkin after a long walk by the Puget Sound. The words he wrote were, "The Door Project." The goal was simple: create the door that had once been opened for him. The Door Project began as a nonprofit tech incubator, but unlike the flashy accelerators in San Francisco, it didn't care about pitch decks or seed stage evaluations. It didn't even have a building at first. Just a small team of engineers and mentors, personally recruited by Daniel, who met with young people from unconventional backgrounds: homeless youth, immigrants, ex-foster kids, formerly incarcerated coders, anyone with drive and curiosity, but no access. There were no fees, no strings, just trust. They gave laptops, internet access, mentorship, and most importantly, space. Space to think, to fail, to build. No pressure to monetize, no metrics to hit. It was about potential, not profit. Daniel took a personal interest in every fellow. He held one-on-ones over cheap sandwiches. He reviewed code at midnight. He handwrote notes of encouragement. And every time someone completed the program, he handed them a key card, not to Meta, but to possibility. One of the first graduates, a 19-year-old single mother named Keisha from Detroit, went on to develop an educational app that taught math through hip-hop lyrics. It was adopted by 6 school districts within its first year. She would later win a National Teaching Award and tell CNN, "Daniel Price didn't teach me how to code. He reminded me I could." Another graduate, a Syrian refugee named Omar, built an offline-first translation platform that was later used by relief workers across 3 continents. He never took venture capital. When asked why, he simply said, "Because the person who helped me didn't want anything back." Over the next decade, the Door Project quietly expanded into 7 cities. Each time, Daniel showed up on opening day, not with a speech, not with cameras, just with coffee and time and a quiet smile. He listened more than he spoke. He refused to sit on boards. He rejected all honorary degrees. When Harvard tried to invite him as a commencement speaker, he told them, "You rejected me once. Let's keep the tradition alive." But his influence was undeniable. Technologists who once chased infinite growth started rethinking their models. A new generation of startups began placing ethics at the core of their code. Investors started asking founders not just what they were building, but why. And through it all, Daniel stayed the same. He still wore hoodies from discount stores, still biked to work, still carried that same weathered backpack. In fact, he once showed it to a group of Door fellows during orientation and said, "This was everything I owned when I walked into Meta. A broken laptop, a notebook, and a sandwich I never got to eat." Someone asked him if he regretted not taking the big buyouts, not becoming a billionaire. He just shook his head. "Money isn't the metric," he said. "Impact is. Legacy is. And you don't measure that in stock options. You measure it in the people who come after you, and the doors you leave open for them." In the quiet moments, Daniel often walked the forests north of Seattle, far from signal, far from noise. He liked being unreachable. He liked remembering what silence felt like. And sometimes, on those walks, he'd stop and sit on a mossy rock, close his eyes, and think of that rainy night, the one where he took a shot in the dark, tapped a stranger on the shoulder, and asked for a chance. He knew now that the moment wasn't magic. It was choice. A choice to speak up. A choice to reach out. A choice to believe that his life could be more than what it had been. That he didn't have to wait for permission to be extraordinary. And so he made a promise to himself and to everyone who came after. If you knock, I will answer. If you fall, I will catch you. If you build, I will help. Because someone once did that for me. Because we are all just one door away from everything we could become. Years passed. Stillnet kept going, steady and quiet. The Door Project grew into a movement. Daniel's name faded from headlines, replaced by the names of those he helped: Keisha, Omar, Timo, Arya, so many others. And that's exactly how he wanted it. He was never chasing glory. He was chasing meaning. One gray morning in late autumn, long after his hair had started to gray and the world had moved on to the next wave of trends, Daniel received a letter. A real one. Not an email. A handwritten envelope, smudged by weather, addressed simply to Daniel Price, Seattle, Washington. No return address. Inside was a photo. A faded, grainy still from a street security cam. It showed a young man, soaked in rain, backpack slung over his shoulder, standing next to a tall figure under an umbrella. Daniel didn't need to read the caption to know what it was. It was that night. The moment that changed everything. Alongside the photo was a note. I was on duty that night. I never forgot your face. You gave me hope I didn't know I'd been looking for. I left my job 6 months later and started teaching computer science at a community college. We use Stillnet in class now. You were the beginning of a ripple you'll never fully see. Daniel sat with the photo for a long time. No one was around. No cameras. No audience. Just him, the letter, and a memory made immortal by someone who'd simply noticed. He stood, crossed the room, and pinned the photo to the wall above his desk, next to sketches from Door Project fellows, the first lines of Stillnet's code, and an old meta hoodie he never wore anymore. It wasn't a trophy wall. It was a reminder that sometimes all it takes is one bold moment, one question asked, one step forward. He turned off the lights, left the office, walked into the misty evening. The city moved around him, quiet, slow, still. And somewhere out there, he knew, someone else was knocking on a door, scared, lost, hungry, hopeful. He smiled, because this time they wouldn't be left outside. Not anymore. In early 2018, Daniel found himself at a strange and unplanned turning point. Stillnet had grown into a quiet giant, not in revenue, not in headlines, but in something harder to measure: reverence. It had become a kind of digital monastery, a sanctuary in the chaos of modern life. Journalists occasionally referred to it as the most important app you've never heard of. Therapists, addiction clinics, and even some corporations had begun integrating it into employee wellness programs. It wasn't loud, but it was everywhere. And yet Daniel felt something missing. Not in the work. In himself. He found it hard to explain, even to Maya, now the quietly brilliant COO of Stillnet. It wasn't burnout, not really. It wasn't ambition either. It was more like restlessness. That subtle pulse under the surface that had first driven him to knock on Zuckerberg's car window all those years ago. The need to build something impossible. That's when he got a letter. Another one, this time from an inmate. The envelope was thick. The handwriting jagged, raw. It came from a federal prison in Nevada. The letter was written by a man named Luis Romero, who had found a pirated copy of Stillnet's source code while working in the prison library. Luis had taught himself to code using contraband PDFs. He built a local version of Stillnet on a beat-up prison terminal, stripped of all but basic command line access. And then he'd started running quiet focus sessions for other inmates. Meditation, study, reflection. He called it cell time. Daniel was stunned. The letter didn't ask for anything. No money, no publicity. Luis didn't even know Daniel still checked his mail personally. He just wanted to say thanks. It hit Daniel harder than he expected. He sent a personal reply. Then he made some calls. 2 weeks later, he was on a plane to Nevada. Prison wasn't what he expected. The guards were suspicious of him at first. A few recognized his name. One whispered, "Isn't he the Zuckerberg guy?" But when he finally met Luis, a wiry man with sharp eyes and a calm presence, something clicked. Luis had created something remarkable, not in code, but in culture. The prisoners who attended his cell time sessions spoke with clarity, calm, even purpose. One man credited it with helping him stay sober. Another said it gave him the strength to write to his estranged daughter. Daniel stayed for 6 hours. Before he left, Luis said, "You built Stillnet to silence the world. I'm using it to listen to myself." That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. The next morning, he made a decision. A big one. He returned to Seattle and called Maya. "We're going into prisons," he said. Thus was born Stillnet Inside, a spin-off initiative that would bring the principles of Stillnet into the correctional system, not just as software, but as a framework for rehabilitation. It took nearly a year to launch. They had to work with the Department of Justice, state governments, advocacy groups. Every piece of hardware had to be customized. Every line of code had to be audited. And they faced heavy opposition: lawmakers who didn't believe inmates deserved mental clarity, conservative pundits who accused Daniel of pampering criminals. He didn't care. He believed in redemption. He believed in second chances. After all, what had his entire life been if not one? The first pilot launched in Nevada, then Arkansas, then Oregon. Stillnet Inside was unlike anything in the system. It offered structured digital silence, reflection journals, breathing exercises, thought prompts, and even a messaging system for inmates to write unsent letters to people they'd wronged. The recidivism rate dropped in every prison that implemented it. A prison warden in Oregon wrote a report calling it a miracle wrapped in an app. A psychologist said it was like handing a monk's mind to a man who'd never had peace. Daniel and Luis stayed in close contact. When Luis was released in 2027, he walked out of prison with a job contract in hand, Stillnet's new director of restorative technology. He cried when he saw the office. "It doesn't feel real," he said. Daniel smiled. "It wasn't until you made it." As Stillnet Inside grew, Daniel felt himself changing. He wasn't just building software anymore. He was building bridges between silence and chaos, guilt and grace, past and future. The company remained intentionally small, but the reach was growing. By 2028, Stillnet was integrated into schools in Norway, jails in South Korea, even refugee camps in Jordan. It wasn't just a wellness tool anymore. It was a practice, a way of life. But with scale came new threats. A former Meta executive, now leading a controversial neurotech startup called Cognix, began attacking Stillnet publicly. He claimed Daniel was stalling innovation and that people didn't need silence, they needed enhancement. Cognix's new product was called Pulse, a neural band device that delivered microdopamine boosts through electrical stimulation tied to work tasks. It promised increased productivity, deeper focus, and total mind optimization. Daniel was horrified. "This is digital amphetamine," he said in a rare podcast interview. "We don't need to force focus. We need to heal." A firestorm followed. Tech blogs erupted. Debates flooded Twitter. Some accused Daniel of being anti-progress. Others called him the last ethical founder. He didn't respond. Instead, he quietly began developing Stillnet's most ambitious project yet, Echo. Echo wasn't an app. It wasn't even software. It was a philosophy embedded into physical space. The idea was simple: a global network of echo houses, minimalist public sanctuaries where people could disconnect for 30 minutes free of charge. No phones, no noise, just stillness, music, warm light, and solitude. The first opened in Vancouver, then Berlin, then Cape Town. People lined up. In the middle of the busiest cities in the world, they came by the hundreds, by the thousands. Not to be entertained, not to escape, but to stop. Daniel watched it unfold from a distance, quietly. He no longer led the day-to-day at Stillnet. Maya had taken over as CEO. Luis ran inside. Daniel became what he always wanted to be: the door opener. One rainy night, nearly a decade after that fateful meeting with Zuckerberg, Daniel received a voicemail from Mark. "Hey," the voice said. "I saw the Cape Town Echo House in the news. I walked through one in Tokyo last week. I sat still for 30 minutes and didn't check my phone once. You win." Then, a pause. "I'm proud of you, man. You changed the game. And this time, you didn't need anyone to open the door. You built it." Daniel never returned the call. He didn't need to. He walked out onto the balcony of his small home near the water. No security, no noise, just wind and sea. He closed his eyes. And somewhere, in cities he would never visit, prisons he would never see, lives he would never meet, silence was spreading. Not the silence of loneliness, but the silence of peace. After everything, the breakthroughs, the programs, the backlash, the quiet victories, Daniel Price eventually stepped away from it all. Not suddenly, not dramatically. It happened gradually, like the tide pulling back from the shore. He moved out of the Stillnet headquarters one afternoon without announcement. Left behind his keycard, his laptop, and a shorthand-written note on the edge of Maya's desk. It read, "Everything we built matters. It's yours now. D." He settled in a small town east of the Cascades, far from the cities, far from the noise. There were no reporters, no farewell articles. Just Daniel, a rental cabin, and a quiet sense of completion. Locals didn't know who he was. He didn't speak much. He volunteered at the local library and rode an old bike down unpaved roads. He read paper books, kept journals, and never once mentioned Stillnet unless someone else brought it up, and even then, he kept his answers short. But the effects of his work remained visible everywhere. In Seattle, the Door Project expanded into a full-blown academy. Not a university, not a boot camp. Something new. People came not for credentials but for direction. The staff, nearly all former fellows, taught others with a kind of reverence for slowness, for precision, for depth. In Oregon, Stillnet Inside reduced violence rates in 3 correctional facilities. Luis, who had once been inmate #A43715, now wore a navy blue jacket with the words "Guidance Mentor" stitched over the heart. He traveled between institutions, met with wardens, and trained inmates in digital stillness. He often quoted Daniel when he spoke, "Stillness doesn't mean stopping. It means starting with yourself." In Berlin, the Echo houses quietly grew in number. No logos, no monetization, just quiet rooms with warm lights, soft cushions, and a 15-minute timer on the wall. The rules were always the same: no phones, no talking, no judgment. Just time to be still. It became part of daily life for thousands of people, especially those who had nowhere else to go. Daniel didn't oversee any of it. He didn't need to. Others carried the torch. His cabin in the Cascades became a strange sort of legend among those who knew where to look. A few people found him: former mints, burnt-out founders, quiet wanderers. He never turned anyone away. He offered tea, silence, and if the moment was right, a story. He kept one photo above his desk. It was the still frame from the security cam, the night he had approached Zuckerberg in the rain, with nothing but a broken laptop in his backpack. The umbrella. The hope. The door that had opened. He never called it luck. He called it timing and readiness. On one of the last recorded interviews he ever gave, when pressed about how he measured success, Daniel simply replied, "By how many people feel safe being themselves. By how many sit in silence without fear. By how many knock on doors and are told, 'Come in.'" He didn't appear in public after that. The world moved on, as it always did. New tech giants rose, others fell. The bus shifted, the market pivoted. But in quiet pockets across the world, in prisons, libraries, refugee shelters, and street corners, people still used Stillnet, still breathed with it, still changed their lives with it. Not because of Daniel, but because of the silence he made possible. And somewhere in the Cascades, in a small wooden cabin surrounded by trees, Daniel Price sat by a window in the early morning light, reading, writing, listening to nothing. And in that stillness, everything he had ever worked for lived on. Maya didn't take over Stillnet with confidence at first. After Daniel's departure, something inside her hesitated, not about the responsibility, but about becoming the face of something that had never been about faces. Stillnet wasn't built to glorify anyone. It was a philosophy wrapped in code, a quiet revolution. And now she stood at the front of it. At first, she tried to operate at scale. She entertained meetings with global NGOs, corporate wellness departments, and academic panels. She signed a partnership deal in London that placed Stillnet into a nationwide school trial. She even held a summit with major mental health foundations, which ended with polite applause and no real substance. 6 months passed. She sat one evening in the Stillnet office alone, lights dimmed, the sound of distant rain against the windows, and felt it all slipping away. It was still working, but it wasn't right. The stillness was missing, not in the product, but in her. So she took a week off. No calls, no meetings, no laptop, just a notebook and a train ticket to Palo Alto. She stood for nearly an hour in the very street where Daniel had once tapped on Mark Zuckerberg's car window, soaked to the skin in the rain. She imagined the version of him that stood there, a broke, desperate student who believed in something deeper than apps. That moment had changed everything. When she returned to Seattle, she rewrote the entire playbook. She canceled all high-scale expansions. She rejected 3 major grant proposals. She reintroduced Friday fellow gatherings in the Stillnet kitchen, just like before, with rice, tea, and no agenda. She scheduled mandatory silent hour at 11 a.m. daily for everyone in the company. And slowly, the heart returned. Stillnet stopped chasing reach and started deepening impact. Their metrics shifted from downloads to transformations. Testimonials became handwritten notes on the wall. Maya led not with charisma, but with presence. Meanwhile, Luis Romero thrived. He had been released from prison with a job title but no sense of direction. Freedom, at first, felt too loud, too fast, too unstructured. For someone who had survived behind walls, the absence of boundaries was disorienting. But he found rhythm in repetition. He returned to several of the prisons where Stillnet Inside had taken root. He didn't arrive as a celebrity. He sat in plastic chairs with inmates, circled up, and asked questions nobody else did. Not about crime, about weight. The kind of weight people carry when no one is watching. He didn't lecture. He listened. Luis wore a dark gray hoodie, no logos. He wrote by hand, rarely used slides. His sessions became rituals. Inmates started calling it the hour, as if it were something sacred. Some prisons adjusted schedules just to accommodate it. Soon, youth detention centers invited him. He visited one school for troubled teens every Friday, quietly entering the back of the classroom and sitting in silence. He didn't introduce himself. He simply sat. The students noticed. One Friday, a boy with a shaved head and broken glasses walked over and asked why he was there. Luis replied, "To hear what doesn't get said." That moment stayed with the boy. A month later, he came back early from lunch to ask Luis how Stillnet was built. While Maya and Luis carried the weight of the movement, Daniel remained quiet in the mountains. He kept no phone, no computer. Just a stack of journals, a kettle, and a simple table by the window. People occasionally found him. Not many. The ones who did were usually former fellows or strangers who had been changed by his work. They arrived with questions, burdens, sometimes tears. Daniel never gave advice. He offered tea and silence and sometimes a story. He kept a box under his bed, filled with handwritten letters he had received over the years. Some from inmates, some from teenagers, some from people in recovery. He read a different one every morning before breakfast. It reminded him that building something small and true had changed things far beyond his control. He didn't miss the stage, or the money, or the tech. He missed the trying, the early days, the hunger, the moments when an idea was just barely possible. He didn't regret leaving, but part of him always lived in that first year, sleeping on floors, drinking gas station coffee, writing code until sunrise. One rainy afternoon, Maya visited him. They sat without words for nearly an hour. Then she pulled out a notebook and read him a letter from a girl in Mumbai who had used Stillnet Inside to help her brother meditate while recovering from heroin withdrawal. Daniel smiled softly. "It's working," he said. Maya replied, You made it work." He shook his head. "No," he said. "I just knocked on the window." In the years that followed, Stillnet remained quiet. There were no acquisitions, no IPO, no media blitz. It grew like a forest, slow, deep, unnoticed from above. But everywhere it touched, something shifted. In a small town in Serbia, a school principal mandated 1 silent hour per week in all classrooms after his daughter, a former addict, told him Stillnet helped her feel real again. In a hospice outside Vancouver, an entire floor used Echo's soft light protocol to ease the anxiety of end-of-life patients. In a college dorm in Kansas, a group of students ran underground still nights, no talking, no screens, just shared space and slow breathing. None of these places appeared in Forbes. None were tagged on Instagram. But they kept growing. Not because someone told them to, but because something inside them remembered. Back in the Cascades, Daniel kept writing. He wrote notes to no one. Stories, observations, single lines like, "Not everything true has a price. Peace is louder than noise when you stop flinching. He who seeks stillness is already halfway home." He never published them. He kept them in a drawer beside the kettle. Occasionally, he mailed one to Maya or Luis. No signature, just a line. He didn't need credit. He didn't need fame. The silence was enough. And in that silence, the world continued to change, slowly, softly, without permission. Because long ago, one broke student stood in the rain and dared to knock. And someone opened the door. In a forgotten corner of Buenos Aires, a woman named Sol ran a community clinic in an old warehouse with a leaky roof and one working printer. Her patients came from all over, the undocumented, the unwanted, the uncounted. Most couldn't afford proper treatment. What they needed wasn't always medicine. They needed quiet, a safe space, time to breathe. Sol had found Stillnet through a stranger. It was a volunteer from Europe, a former DOOR fellow who had traveled for a year teaching trauma-informed coding practices. He never spoke much, just carried a USB stick with Stillnet installed and offered it to anyone who asked. Sol downloaded it onto 2 donated laptops. She didn't expect anything, but within a week, her patients began requesting it, before exams, before difficult conversations, before walking home through dangerous streets. She cleared out a small room at the back of the clinic, painted the walls warm orange, added a second-hand recliner chair and a small speaker that played a single 10-minute loop of low wind and soft bells. She called it the Silencio Room. Nobody advertised it, but people kept coming. One afternoon, a young boy, 9, maybe 10, came in alone, no parent in sight. He sat in the recliner for exactly 10 minutes, breathing with his eyes closed, hands clenched into little fists. When the chime sounded at the end, he opened his eyes and whispered, "I didn't want to disappear anymore." Sol cried that night when she closed the clinic, not because she was overwhelmed, but because something worked. In Lagos, Nigeria, a man named Obinna started the Third Floor Project with 3 recycled laptops and a broken server. He had once been a network engineer for a telecom company before a factory explosion left him deaf in one ear and without work. He stumbled upon a translated Stillnet manual on a forum meant for urban educators. The language was simple. The idea? Radical. Stillness in a world addicted to noise. He converted the 3rd floor of a vacant apartment building into a center for digital clarity. Not meditation, not therapy. Just 1 hour of still coding, reflection, and breath. Local students, overworked mothers, ex-gang members, they came up those broken stairs because down below, the city never slept. He didn't have funding, but the idea spread. Soon, another center opened in Accra, then another in Nairobi. By the time someone from the African Union visited in person to observe, over 2,000 individuals had passed through 3rd floor rooms. None of them had ever heard of Daniel Price, but they quoted him. Printed on paper, scotch taped to every wall, were his words. When the noise ends, the work begins. In Warsaw, Poland, a high school philosophy teacher named Marta ran a secret curriculum. Her school was rigid, formal, governed by outdated methods. Students memorized Kant and Nietzsche by rote. They could recite arguments but felt nothing. So Marta began doing something dangerous. She turned off the lights for 15 minutes every Wednesday. No phones, no movement, no tests. She called it the invisible lecture. Her students protested at first, but then something shifted. Some began writing journals. Others stopped skipping class. One student, who had struggled with anxiety and was failing most subjects, passed her final exams after finding a rhythm inside that silence. One day, Marta printed out a single sheet and pinned it to the faculty board. No explanation, just a quote. Stillness isn't the opposite of progress. It's the shape of meaning. Her principal removed it, said it was unprofessional. She smiled, went home, and taped the same quote to her apartment door. Back in the mountains, Daniel continued to live simply. He didn't know these stories, not directly. Occasionally, Maya sent him letters or news clippings. Luis would call from a borrowed landline and leave a two-sentence message. Stillnet's in South Korea now. Volunteers, not partners. Then he'd hang up. Daniel would listen to the message once, then go for a walk in the woods, hands in his pockets, heart heavier than ever, but in the right way. He kept his space sparse. One kettle, one chair, one lamp, and a box of memories. Inside were old photos, torn notes, even the very first email he had sent to Zuckerberg, the one that was never answered but somehow led to everything. He never resented the silence that followed that ignored message. It taught him a lesson that even his own platform couldn't digitize. Doors don't open when you deserve them. They open when you knock without needing them to. And so the world moved on. Social media changed its skin again. Attention spans shrank. Corporations absorbed every buzzword and emptied it of meaning. People got richer. Others fell behind. But beneath the noise, there remained pockets, silent rooms, breathing codes, unmarketed gatherings of strangers who had found Stillnet and found themselves inside it. None of it was magic. None of it was easy. But it endured. Not because Daniel demanded it, but because he released it. In Boston, a tech journalist named Ellis Grant made it his mission to dismantle what he called the cult of Stillnet. He didn't believe in the hype. To him, Stillnet wasn't a revolution. It was a clever brand wrapped in monk-like aesthetics. He'd built his reputation exposing false prophets in Silicon Valley, and now, Daniel Price was his next target. Ellis wrote scathing articles. He described the Echo Protocol as New Age minimalism disguised as neuroscience. He accused the Door Fellows of creating digital monasteries that teach withdrawal, not resilience. He even claimed Stillnet was manipulating post-prison populations through emotional engineering. But Ellis made one mistake. He tried it. Just once. He installed the original version on a second-hand MacBook in his office late one night. He didn't tell anyone. He ran one 20-minute session out of pure cynicism, convinced it would bore him. But when the session ended, Ellis realized something unsettling. He couldn't move. Not out of fear, but out of quiet. For the first time in years, the gears in his head weren't spinning. He sat there, breathing, tears running down his cheeks for reasons he couldn't articulate. He never published a retraction. But 2 months later, he deleted his Twitter account and quietly joined a retreat in Vermont run by former Door Fellows. He left behind his pen name, his outrage, and something else, his armor. Stillnet wasn't always used with care. In Tokyo, a major advertising firm co-opted the protocol to increase productivity. They stripped away the philosophy and used the stillness intervals as stress-resetting tools to squeeze more output from burnout interns. It worked for a while. Then came the collapse. A junior designer named Saito suffered a breakdown during a forced echo loop. He had lost sleep, skipped meals, and meditated only because his manager scheduled it into the calendar. Stillnet became a weapon, not a refuge. His story leaked to the public. Critics worldwide pounced. They called Stillnet dangerous, abusable, naive. Maya flew to Tokyo without press. She sat with Sato's family. She apologized in person. Then she wrote a letter, not to defend the app, but to warn others. She published it on Stillnet's homepage. No PR team, No edits. Just her voice. Stillness, like water, takes the shape of the vessel it's poured into. If that vessel is control, it will drown. If it's power, it will corrode. But if it's trust, it heals. We are not here to be used. We are here to be remembered. That letter was translated into 38 languages by users themselves. Luis faced resistance, too. In Detroit, he visited a halfway house where Stillnet inside had been integrated into a rehabilitation program. The counselor in charge ran it like a military unit. Stillness was enforced with strict punishments for anyone who moved or spoke. Luis shut the program down within a week. He stood before the staff and said plainly, "Silence without dignity is not healing. It's just another prison." Then he took the hardest case, an ex-gang member named Dre, out for coffee. They sat in a parking lot for 2 hours, didn't speak much, and just breathed. It was Dre's first moment of peace in years. Weeks later, Dre would start his own small circle in his cousin's garage. No schedule, no leader, just an hour of mutual stillness every Sunday. He called it Breathe or Bleed. People laughed at the name until they sat in it. Then they understood. Daniel never fought the criticism. He read it sometimes, in the library down in the town. A part of him flinched, naturally. But mostly he smiled. The critics confirmed something. Stillnet was real enough to be feared. But his joy came from elsewhere. One winter, a handwritten note arrived at his cabin. It was barely legible, pencil on notebook paper, torn at the edges. "My father used Stillnet to stop hitting us. He never said sorry. But after 6 weeks, he started knocking before entering my room. That was enough. Thank you." Daniel read that note by the fire in silence for almost an hour. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the same box that held his first scribbled sketches for Stillnet. He didn't add anything. He didn't write a reply. He just closed the lid. Stillnet had become something nobody could own. It wasn't a company anymore. Not really. It was a language. A practice, a kind of gravity that pulled certain people towards something truer. Even as other mindfulness apps rose and fell with trends, Stillnet persisted not because it was superior, but because it never chased attention. It was an invitation, not a campaign. A door, not a destination. And in the quiet corners of the world, in hospitals, in halfway homes, in art studios, in refugee camps, in the back of restaurants where workers stole 10 minutes of silence after a shift, Stillnet lived. In breaths, in rituals, in pauses that had never existed before. One night, years after the first version of the app went live, Maya visited Daniel again. She was older, a little tired, but calm in a way that only people who've walked through fire can be. They sat outside his cabin under stars that didn't care about business models or growth curves. She handed him a small wooden box, no label. Inside were dozens of pebbles. Smooth, warm-colored, each etched with a single word in different languages. Words like home, enough, stay, truth, again. "These are from the Stillnet archive," she said. "We started collecting them from users. They sent us a word that came to them in stillness. One word only." Daniel picked up a pebble that read, "Forgiven." He held it gently and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he whispered, "That's all we ever needed." In the final years of Daniel Price's life, very little changed on the surface. He remained in his cabin in the mountains, waking early, boiling water for tea, walking along the same trails he had walked since his early 30s. His beard grew fuller, his steps slower. But the core of him, silent, alert, quietly watching the world pass by, remained sharp. He wasn't a recluse. He welcomed visitors, occasionally. Former fellows, distant cousins, a retired teacher from Palo Alto who had once scolded him for writing in the margins of his textbooks. They came with questions, sometimes with reverence, sometimes with grief. Daniel never offered answers. He listened. That was always his gift. Not invention, not vision, but presence. One autumn, a woman named Esther came to see him. She was 27, wore glasses with cracked frames, and carried a backpack with an old laptop and a battered notebook. She had walked 5 miles up the road from the town, refusing help from a local driver. Daniel met her at the steps. said nothing, just nodded, opened the door, and gestured for her to sit. She sat, then cried. Not loud, not messy. Just quiet tears that ran steadily as if they'd been waiting years for permission to fall. When she finally spoke, her voice barely carried across the room. I was going to end my life. A year ago. But still, Ned, it gave me a reason to wait. To breathe again. To see what might happen if I didn't disappear. And I'm still here. I wrote a book. It's not published. It's not even good. But I wrote it. That's something, right? Daniel reached into the small shelf beside his chair and pulled out a small object, a smooth white pebble, etched with a single word. Stay. He placed it in her hand. That was all. Esther didn't take a photo, didn't record the moment. She just wept again, this time not from sorrow, but from being seen. She left the next morning before sunrise. Years later, her book Quiet Winds would be translated into 11 languages. Daniel's health declined slowly. His heart began to give out. There were warning signs: fatigue, breathlessness, that familiar tightness in his chest. But he refused hospitalization, not out of pride, but out of readiness. He knew what was coming. He had prepared for it not with denial, but with stillness. One evening, Maya and Luis arrived at the cabin without calling first. They had grown older too, Maya with streaks of silver in her hair, Luis with a cane from an old knee injury. They brought no gifts, only presents. The three of them sat outside in silence as the sun fell behind the trees. For nearly an hour, no one spoke. Then Daniel broke the silence. Do you know what the last version of Stillnet I wrote was called? Luis shook his head. Daniel smiled. Version 0. Maya tilted her head. You never released that one. I didn't need to, he said. It wasn't code. It was a moment. The one where I stopped needing to add anything. They understood. Not with logic, but with breath. With the quiet recognition that Stillnet had never been about him, or even the app. It was about what happened when people stopped long enough to face themselves. Daniel Price died quietly 2 months later, alone in his sleep, in the chair by the fire, a book in his lap and a pen resting on the floor where it had fallen from his hand. He was 68 years old. There was no public funeral. Per his request, his body was cremated and his ashes scattered in the stream near his cabin, the same one he'd sat by when Stillnet had first been a whisper in his mind. But the world didn't forget him. In the years that followed, Stillnet became more than an app or even a movement. It became a culture. Teachers integrated it into classrooms, not as a module, but as a rhythm. 10 minutes of stillness before exams. 5 minutes after conflict. A moment of breath before apology. Libraries set aside echo hours where no one was allowed to speak, not as a rule, but as a ritual. Construction workers in Brazil paused their shifts to sit under scaffolding and listen to wind sounds. A collective in Denmark reimagined the app into sculpture, a room of suspended glass orbs that lit up based on the breath patterns of people inside. In Sarajevo, a memorial was built for war survivors. Not a statue, not a plaque, just a soundproof stone room with one light and a Stillnet terminal on a wall. Survivors could enter alone, press a single button, and be guided through breath and memory. There were still critics. Of course, there always were. But even they began to acknowledge Stillnet had become something bigger than anyone expected. It had quietly rewired the way a small part of the world handled pain. The final version of the Stillnet archive included a single, unmarked file. No title, just a timestamp and a plaintext document. Inside, the only words written by Daniel in his final year. The silence between us is not absence. It's invitation. It says, you're still here. And so am I. That's all we need, really. Just that. That line would later be etched in over 4,000 places worldwide. On the inside of coffee shop walls, on bookmarks slipped into therapy books, on the back of door frames, even inside prison cells. No one trademarked it. No one needed to. And that's how it ended. Not with a product launch, not with an IPO, but with a breath. With a man who learned how to disappear the right way, not to escape, but to make space for others to arrive. And arrive they did, one breath at a time. The cabin was quiet, as always. Daniel sat on the back steps, a chipped mug of tea in his hands, steam rising into the morning cold. He watched a pair of birds flit between pine branches, their wings slicing the stillness with tiny bursts of life. He smiled. He'd seen these birds before. Not the same ones, of course, but close enough. The world had moved on from him, and he was glad. Stillnet now lived in other hands. A small council, none of them famous, had quietly stewarded its growth. Not as executives, but as gardeners. They didn't change much. They didn't innovate for the sake of innovation. They only pruned, cleared clutter, kept it alive. Luis had taken up teaching. He now led a program for formerly incarcerated youth, using breathwork and silence as daily rituals. Maya had started a small print journal, The Pause, which published handwritten letters from Stillnet users all over the world. No ads, no subscriptions, just paper, ink, and truth. And as for Daniel, he stopped checking the metrics years ago. He didn't need numbers to tell him Stillnet was working. He saw it in the letters he still received, handwritten ones, folded carefully and delivered by people who walked all the way up the dirt road just to place them in a tin mailbox he had once built from scrapwood. He never answered them, but he read every word. One late summer afternoon, a girl no older than 20 knocked at his door. She didn't introduce herself, just looked nervous, holding a small notebook. Daniel opened the door wide and gestured for her to sit on the porch. They didn't talk for almost an hour. She finally said, "I thought I was broken. Stillnet didn't fix me, but it helped me listen to the part of me that wasn't screaming." Daniel nodded, slowly. "That's where healing starts," he said. Then he offered her something unexpected, a rake. He handed it to her and pointed toward a stretch of leaves on the side of the cabin. She raked silently for half an hour while he chopped wood. When she left behind the notebook. Inside was one sentence: "Sometimes, being seen quietly is the loudest love there is." He placed it on a shelf with the others. Stillnet wasn't the center of the world. It didn't become a billion-dollar company. It wasn't a trend on social media. It faded from headlines. But it never faded from people's lives. In a refugee camp in Turkey, aid workers used it to teach traumatized children how to regulate breath through humming. In a remote village in Canada, a schoolteacher replaced detention with 15-minute echo sessions and saw the fight rate drop to 0. In a senior home in Chicago, for residents who had lost their spouses started a still circle. They didn't speak. They sat together every Wednesday at 4 p.m. just to be still, together, for 30 minutes. They wore matching t-shirts that read, "Not alone, just quiet." And Daniel? He remained where he was, slowly becoming part of the land itself. He tended the trail. He kept a candle burning in the window at night for travelers who might lose their way. He wrote, not to publish, but to clear space in his own mind. He grew tomatoes. He learned to repair old radios. Sometimes he didn't speak for days. Not out of sadness, but because no words were necessary. Every so often, someone would hike the long path up to the cabin. Daniel would open the door, offer them a seat, and pour tea. Sometimes they cried. Sometimes they just stared into the trees. He never tried to heal them. He only sat with them. That was enough. Because Stillnet was no longer a platform. It had become a memory, a rhythm, a culture. It had become the breath people returned to when the world tried to fracture them again. And Daniel? He was still here. Not to lead, not to teach, just to live. Quietly, deliberately, present, always. The seasons turned slowly at the cabin. Winters came with long silences, heavy with snow. Daniel would spend hours by the fire, reading worn-out letters, tracing the lines with his fingers like braille. Spring brought visitors, hikers, strangers, a monk once from Kyoto who said nothing for 3 days and left behind a single origami crane on the porch railing. Daniel didn't keep the crane. He let the wind take it. One summer, a little boy arrived with his mother. She had been one of the first Stillnet users during its beta years. Back when it was nothing more than a glitchy app with a blue circle and a voice that sometimes cut out mid-sentence. She said nothing about those days. She just placed the boy on the porch steps, sat beside him, and showed him how to breathe it slowly, deeply, with his hand over his heart. Daniel watched them from the garden. When the boy looked up and asked, "What happens when the circle disappears?" She smiled and answered, "You're ready." Daniel turned back to the soil, smiling. He didn't need the world to know him. He didn't want statues or tributes. He only wanted this: that long after he was gone, people would sit with each other without speaking, without fixing, without fleeing. Just being. That would be enough. And it was. It truly was.